My favorite Stephen King film is actually a made-for-TV miniseries called Rose Red, about a house that was famously haunted and a team of paranormal investigators who go inside to try to find scientific proof of the paranormal. I ran into it for the first time when it was being broadcast on television somewhere, and from that point onward, I investigated what the thing was called and how to experience that entire thing, and I ended up just buying the DVD for it. And I found out that it also had a companion book that was not written by Stephen King, which was published after the series came out, called The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer. The book was bad. It had all the vibes that the miniseries movie had, but it was just, not great. It was bad, and so it left me wanting. And then, one day, I found out that The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson existed, and I realized how much of King's miniseries was heavily based on this book. It makes sense that King's story didn't have a King book that it was based on, because this was the basis for it. Now, obviously, Jackson and King have very different styles of telling a story, but on the front cover of my copy of Hill House is a quote by Stephen King praising the story as nearly perfect a haunted house tale as I have ever read. So, let's talk The Haunting of Hill House. Backstory time. Shirley Jackson, the author, was introduced to the literary world when her very famous short story, The Lottery, you probably know this story from high school, received widespread acclaim and exposure. She even received hate mail for writing it, which I think is kind of the mark of a good story, when you start receiving hate mail because it was so scary or because it was so politically challenging or something. But anyway, this sets the stage for one of her most famous works, against the background of an American manor house outside the fictional village of Hillsdale, Massachusetts. The story goes that Hill House was built 80-ish years ago by an old rich man named Hugh Crane, who hoped to bring his family up in the house and then see the end of his own days there. Now, his wife never ended up seeing the house actually completed because she died in a carriage accident literally on the way up the driveway to the house. The carriage that she was in overturned and she died, which left Crane with two small daughters to raise in this huge, horrifyingly large, twisting manor. And over the next several years, he married again. Twice, losing both wives to unforeseen circumstances, and decided thereafter to just close up the house and send the girls off to live with a relative, a sister of his aunt or something like that. So after that, the girls basically fought 24 hours a day about who should actually own the house, and it eventually came that after Crane's death, the sisters came to some kind of off-screen agreement that the elder sister was supposed to get the house on provision that the younger sister would receive a bunch of treasures that were inside of the house, in particular, a set of gold-trimmed plates that seemed to be a pretty solid point of contention for them. Now, the elder sister then went to live in the house and took a companion girl from the nearby village and hired servants from the village as well. After several years, the elder sister died of pneumonia and left the house to this companion. Of course, this started a tremendous legal battle between the legal owner of the house, the companion, and the one who swore up and down that the sister was tricked into signing it away in the first place, the younger sister. It is at this point that the first indications of strangeness, let's call it, outside of the multitude of deaths that happened there or near there start to occur, as the companion begins to swear that the younger sister would break into the house at night to steal things, despite no evidence being available of a break-in ever. The only provable things were some objects that went missing, in particular, a certain set of gold-rimmed dishes, one which would be very difficult to steal in the middle of the night all at once, on account of it being a full set of dishes. But anyway, the younger sister pestered the companion even after the court case ruled that the companion was the legal owner of the house, and ended up turning everyone's opinion in the village against the companion so much that she killed herself eventually. Yeah, she hung herself in the house. They say that she did it in the tower that is there, but the characters in the story make a mention that if there is a tower in the house and someone killed themselves in it, it only stands to reason that the story would go that she hung herself in the tower. The younger sister, however, did never end up giving up harassing anyone who comes to own the house, up to and including the current owners, the Sanderson family. She, of course, eventually also dies. The Sanderson family's coming up the driveway, and the younger sister is there and tries to harass them. The Sandersons call the police, the younger sister gets dragged off by the police, and then nobody ever hears from her again. So that's the publicly available story for Hill House. Now let's meet the cast of characters. I'm doing this video somewhat different from most of the other story videos that I do, where I give like a plot summary and then talk about the things that happened in the plot. I'm going to treat this as though you have already read the story, or at least know kind of what's going on in it, because this script is already really long and I've had to edit a lot out. So count this like it's an academic paper and I'm expecting you to have already read it. So anyway, the cast of characters. First, there's Dr. John Montague, or Montague. I'm going with Montague because it's American. He's a doctor of philosophy who felt that his true calling was not philosophy, but rather to prove the existence of the supernatural in an academic, scientific, and provable way. So it was he who organized the entire trip, he who sent the letters to all the people who had some kind of record with the supernatural, as it sent these like invitations to come and be part of the research at the house. He bankrolled the whole thing, he organized the short lease of the house from the Sandersons, and he gathered all the people. He is the sort of rational, if somewhat credulous man. One who takes his scientific work seriously, but who also has the theatrical air of the professor, and the minor superstition that is necessary for someone to have when they are seriously engaged in the field of the supernatural. Next to him is Luke Sanderson, the family relation on whom the allowance of the short lease was predicated. Basically, Mrs. Sanderson, who actually owned the house, persuaded the doctor that he wouldn't be allowed to do his experiments unless there was a family member there with him, ostensibly to make sure that he doesn't steal anything, but really it was because Luke was a nuisance sort of person who his aunt would love to have just tucked away for a little while, engaged in something so that she wouldn't have to deal with him. And the book initially describes him as a liar and a thief and a con man, but his characterization makes him out to be more just extremely charismatic and flippant rather than any kind of actual sinister. It seems more than anything he's lazy. At any rate, he's the one that's set to inherit the house in the future. So those are those two. And then after that is Theodora, who uses no last name. Theodora is an artist who sold her art in a little shop somewhere and who lives her life with the sort of reckless abandon that I imagine my life also might have if I were not constantly worried about money and debt. In any case, it's pretty heavily implied that Theodora is a lesbian, but it's also very important that she's on the record for having telepathic abilities. Her reputation for the Ghostbusters symbols on the cards test, where they hold the card up and then she guesses what symbol is on the card, her record for that extremely positive, like crazy high scores 4 times in a row, and that's what caught the doctor's attention. So her own kind of devil-may-care attitude mixed with some domestic dispute with her roommate caused her to take on the charge of coming to the house, so that whole thing could calm down for a little bit, and then when she goes back, she and her totally roommate, we promise, female partner would be able to laugh about the whole thing and not be angry at each other. And finally, in the cast of main characters is Eleanor Vance, a sensitive, let's call her woman of 32 years, who lives with her sister and her sister's husband, I guess, and who basically hates everything about her life. Her invalid mother had died some time before, which freed her from her 11-year-long stint as involuntary caretaker, but then also ultimately relieved her of any actual purpose that she had in her life. So Eleanor, who is basically the focal character of the book, if you don't consider the actual house itself to be the main character, seems to have this kind of long period of poltergeist activity. Like, there was a time at her house when she was 12, and her father had just recently died, and the activity that they mentioned in the book involved a steady rain of humongous large stones that just sort of inexplicably came down out of the sky onto their house for 3 days, which only stopped when Theo and her sister had been moved to a relative's house. And of course, their mother had said that it was the neighbors being spiteful about something, like I guess they didn't like the dad or something like that, and so it was actually the neighbor's fault, but that was completely unable to be proved, and I mean, they were pretty big rocks getting thrown through the top of their house. So this was 2 decades ago at this point, this bit of the poltergeist activity, but the records of the event were still within the doctor's circle of research. And it just so happened that Eleanor, who had basically forgotten the whole thing, needed something to make her life worth actually living, and a way to get away from her oppressive sister. So she went to the house. Now, of course, her sensitivity as a human was not just the emotionally fragile kind, but turned out rather to be paranormal in nature as well, as we will see throughout the story. In the cast of supporting characters are the Dudleys, an odd couple that occupy the gate and groundskeeper position, and the housekeeper and cook position, Mr. and Mrs. While we only really see Mr. Dudley very briefly at the beginning of the book, while he's trying to be antagonistic to Eleanor and won't let her in the gate, he's characterized as this kind of curmudgeonly and unlikable jerk who kind of intrudes into Eleanor's way as she tries to make her way into the house in her car that she stole from her sister. It is he who lets us, the readers, first know that nobody ever comes into this house save for him and his wife for anything longer than a couple days, and he prefers it that way. But also, and this is important, he wouldn't stay there after dark if he were you. Mrs. Dudley has a ton more page time. Do you say page time instead of screen time? Anyway, she's the one who comes to the house every day on this sort of rigid, machine-like cuckoo clock schedule, refusing to deviate from the script, both of her movements and actions, and her spoken dialogue options. Completely, at all. She refuses to make conversation, save for to remind the erstwhile residents of the specific times that she will do things, and what those things will be at those specific times. Though it must be said that her skills as a culinary artist are superb. She's displayed almost as creepily as the house itself, a disagreeable sort of presence that serves its purpose well, but which both sides of the transactional parties would prefer not to have to deal with. Anyway, towards the end of the book, we're also introduced to the doctor's wife, Mrs. Montague, who is an insufferable twat in every possible respect. She is a firm believer in spiritualism, as though she just walked directly out of the Victorian age, and she feels that it is her duty to help the poor spirits of the dead who are trapped in the realm of the living through communication via her favorite personified tool, planchette. Which is like if you took the planchette from a Ouija board and instead of putting a Ouija board under it, stuck a ballpoint pen on it, and then the movements spell out words and that kind of business. So it's a sort of automatic writing. Boy, oh boy, I hate this woman. The way she's presented, we the readers are meant to think that she is a fanatic who either is making up all of her supernatural experiences for attention, or else truly believes that what she is experiencing is actual, real ghosts. Even though it definitely isn't. But whatever the case, it's clear that she is a fake. She is a complete fraud. And she bustles into the story with entitled self-importance, matched only by her insistence that her husband believe her true facts about the supernatural communications that she experiences with her companion, Arthur. Arthur is a headmaster of a school, and he's also embroiled in Miss Montague's paranormal obsession, though my theory actually is that he doesn't care very much about that at all, and it's in fact the reality that Arthur and Mrs. Montague are having an affair, and this is the pretense that the both of them use to have Arthur be around basically all the time and do like secret things with Miss Montague. This is an entire like term paper's worth of stuff that I would love to say about this one, but again, this script is already so very long. Anyway, he is somewhat more crass than the Doctor, and somewhat less likable than Luke, but he is definitely glued to the elbow of Miss Montague, for reasons on which I have already speculated. He carries a pistol like a like a real man, and declares that he will keep everyone safe, and then does nothing of real significance in the story whatsoever except to be set dressing for Mrs. Montague. He is insufferable, but not the same level of insufferable as Miss Montague. I'm really sure he's just there for the tale. But anyway, lastly, and most importantly, is the house itself. The strange thing about the house is that it was built purposefully to be at incorrect angles. Like, most things are built at 90 degrees to each other, or they have like a good 45, or, angles that make sense for things. This house was built to be like 1 degree off here, and a degree and a half off over here, and like the slight tilt of a single degree here or there, built with intent into the house, is what makes the Doctor initially presume that all of the doors swing shut on their own, because they're built into, like, the door frame that leans toward the doorknob. So it opens up this way, and then gravity pulls it back down. There's something else about it as well. Like, I don't know. The whole house is just, like, off kilter by tiny degrees. But enough of these little, almost unnoticeable angles being off results in the summation of a house that feels impossible, that gives this, like, sense of unnaturalness simply by looking at it, by being inside or even being nearby. God forbid you actually go inside, because then you start to get used to it. And then when you go back outside, the world is the thing that is wrong. The Doctor mentions it as like when you're used to being on a boat and then you go back to land. On land, the things are correct, but they feel off because you're so used to the small things that change with life on a boat, or, as the case may be, life in Hill House. The party becomes somewhat used to the little, like, idiosyncrasies that the physical build of the house has, but then when they're confronted with them directly, and you are, like, told, yes, actually, this is why you are feeling these things, because the house itself is wrong, those things suddenly become alien. However, this is not the only strange thing about the house. Just ambiently, with no scientific explanation whatsoever, the house has a cold spot in the doorway to the nursery that refuses to be measured by any instruments, thermometers, measuring tapes. They try to, like, draw a chalk outline of where it is on the floor, completely unmeasurable, but it is very cold. And this room is where the Doctor presumes that all the paranormal occurrences begin, or at least the one from which they all issue. We don't really get any real note of that anywhere, and in fact I would like to think that it's not that at all, but it's a creepy room just by itself nonetheless. It's the only room in the house that seems to be untouched by Mrs. Dudley's machine-like cleaning schedule. It's got these two kind of grotesque statuary heads of children that stare at you when you enter the place, and then this cold spot is described by their telepath Theo as being not impartial, as though someone was intentionally trying to shock whoever passes through this doorway using ghost cold magic or something. Now, within the house, there's also the stone tower that we mentioned earlier, which is kind of mismatched with the rest of the house, but is imposing nonetheless. And it has a library inside of it and has a sort of rotted wooden spiral staircase that goes up to the parapet, where it is rumored that the companion girl hanged herself. Still, again, no actual proof of that, but anyway, this alone would be creepy, but it's here that the first selective paranormal thing happens. During the initial tour of the house, Eleanor finds that she cannot go inside of this library tower when the others do, for some reason that she finds attached to her own mother, but which she cannot properly articulate. She comes up and she's like, "Oh, I can't go inside. Mother." Wait, what am I talking about? This is a strange and unexplainable sort of revulsion for this room, one which she does encounter again later, but it is something that only she experiences. Nobody else has any problems going into the library. Eleanor shares the experience of hearing something stomping up and down the hallways and banging on doors at night with Theo, whose room connects with her own through a sort of Jack and Jill bathroom. And then later on, when Theo moves into her room, because there is a weird paranormal thing where all of Theo's stuff is ruined because somebody has written in blood all over it, a thing which we will talk about later. So those two are able to perceive this thing, something that stomps up and down the hallways, slams on the doors, figures out that they're in Eleanor's room, and tries to open the door but is unsuccessful in doing so. This occurrence actually happens a number of times, with a varying number of people experiencing it each time. The first time around, of course, it's just those two, and during that first time, there's a mention of like a dog creature or something like that the Doctor and Luke go chasing out of the house at that same time, ostensibly so that the women and the men are separated somehow, though we don't really get any payoff from that later, I don't think. And there's also instances of writing appearing on the walls and furniture, the first time in chalk, and then the second time in blood, like we mentioned earlier. This writing is actually really important, though, because it mentions Eleanor by name, and even seems to legitimately communicate to Miss Montague through her precious fraud machine, the planchette. It becomes very clear both to the readers and to the characters in the story that things seem to be centered around the presence of Eleanor and Eleanor's actions. The house itself calls to Eleanor and catches her in some kind of subconscious thrall or control or something. It begins with hallucinations, some of which are shared by Theo, but many of which are her own perception. And that's weird, but here is where it gets interesting. I haven't read a lot of academic analysis on this story, but if I were writing it, probably a great deal of it would come to Eleanor having like a mental illness of some sort, one which would cause hallucinations, incorrect perception of reality, dissociation, blending of reality and imagination, that sort of thing, delusions. Some sort of psychosis would explain some of the things that we see in her experience, like the incident where she and Theo were sitting on their beds and Eleanor grips Theo's hand in the dark, only to freak out when it becomes clear that 1, there wasn't any dark in the first place, and 2, Theo was not in arm's reach, so whose hand was she holding? That shouts hallucination. Eleanor also has this increasing ability to feel what's going on in the house, even in places she cannot see, and that could be ascribed to like a delirium or fantasy. There's enough instances where a strong case can be made that Eleanor definitely has some kind of mental illness. But even if it were true, even if it were the fact that Eleanor was mentally ill in some sort, it wouldn't solve the story unless some really strong and irrational leaps were taken in that analysis. I propose that there are 3 levels at which this story can be, and probably most commonly is, read. 1, where everything has a completely mundane explanation and that Eleanor is simply severely mentally ill. 1, where everything that happens is due to actual paranormal power from the house. And 1, where both things are true. The straightforward reading, where there are supernatural powers at work and there are ghosts, and that causes the story to be a haunted house tale, that one's easy. The hallucinations are caused by the house, the physical changes are real, the house's internal movements and disturbances are all real things caused by ghost magic or whatever, and they are to be read at face value. This is an entertaining read, and one which leads to a lot of very fascinating conclusions. That's one reading. The second reading, the extremely strained reading, where everything weird that we see is a product of Eleanor's illness of mind, is a stretch at best and impossible at worst, because it would require the narrator to be incredibly unreliable, while at the same time also being omniscient and showing multiple different focuses and character viewpoints. It would require such extreme suspension of disbelief from the readers as to make the suggestion that the actual narrative itself, like the words on the physical page, may not be occurring at all and are instead all the product of the delusion that Eleanor inhabits. And that's not impossible, but it is a stretch. Like, the reader would be required to read the text with the understanding that it may not even be happening, and that the omniscient narrator through whose eyes we experience the entire story, one who is not personified whatsoever, is in fact Eleanor the entire time, making up what we see. This is basically impossible to take seriously. It's a huge stretch. I could not in good faith make that argument unless I were trying really hard to write a very contrarian paper about it. But the third reading, that's where things get really weird and interesting, because it hinges not only on Eleanor's hypersensitivity to the supernatural, but also to Theo's having telepathic abilities and the house being able to amplify both of them. Like, the only two people that actually come into the house and are somewhat psychic, because, like, Dr. Montague tries to contact a ton of people, and, like, 4 people say yes, but only 2 end up actually showing, and it's Theo and Eleanor. And so it's the doctor, the, like, charismatic family member, and then 2 paranormally adjacent women. And that's all we get in there, right? Take, for instance, the incident where Theo and Eleanor go out for a kind of impromptu walk and find this sunny garden with a picnic and beautiful flowers and, like, it looks all fun and nice and warm and everything, only for it to have been revealed to have been a hallucination the entire time. And Theo saw something behind them and screamed, "Don't look back, don't look back," and they ran back to the house for some measure of safety. That screams hallucination. This could be because the house forced the vision onto the sensitive Eleanor, and then Theo's telepathic abilities, which are also amplified, caused them both to share the experience. Like, we have evidence several times in the story of Theo directly quoting the internal thoughts of Eleanor directly after she thinks them, or of her answering questions or making responses to thoughts that Eleanor has completely internally, so it's no surprise that Theo can share the thoughts of others around her, though we only ever really see the evidence of her doing it with Theo, another paranormal person, I guess. This would mean that initially, the house might have targeted Eleanor because of her extreme sensitivity, but when Theo came along, it was a double benefit because Theo could act as a broadcaster to others. Eleanor is sensitive to the paranormal and susceptible to whatever forces are in the house. Theo is capable of reading others' minds, and with the house amplifying her supernatural ability, capable further of broadcasting it to other people. Now, all the house has to do is show something to Eleanor. Theo's powers pick up the sensitivity hallucination from Eleanor and broadcast it to everyone nearby. The house is haunted. Eleanor is mentally ill. Both things are true at the same time. But however, even this cannot completely explain everything as purely hallucinatory, like the planchette, which is normally a fraud thing that I would decry completely. The planchette writes down Eleanor's name to the 2 complete fraud newcomers who were used to having psychic experiences. That's not a hallucination. Somehow they managed to get these words, Eleanor and mom and help and home and all of that, out of this session of so-called automatic writing. And we know that it has to be legitimate because when Mrs. Montague comes out, she confesses that she thought that Theo was actually Eleanor. So there's no way that she could have made that cold read correctly if she thought that the people were switched. So that's actually something legitimately paranormal there. So what is it? What's actually happening? What is haunting Hill House? Because the story is called The Haunting of Hill House. So what is haunting Hill House? I think the answer is exceedingly complicated, because Hill House doesn't exactly follow much of the conventional haunted house rules that have been established with, like, cheap pulp fiction through which people have osmosed the rules of haunted houses, right? Like, yes, there was at least one tragic death there. The suicide of the companion that the elder sister took is the only one that really follows the established patterns, right? Like, okay, the first wife, Crane's first wife died on the grounds of the house, but not inside, and it was an accident. The second one died from some kind of fall, which is left ambiguous and therefore could count. Okay, we'll take it. The third died of consumption. Okay, fine, whatever. Crane actually died somewhere in Europe, so it's a hard stretch to say that his ghost, soul, spirit is involved with this thing. The elder sister died of pneumonia, which is rumored but not proven to be because the companion neglected her in favor of having boys over or something like that, and didn't take care of her enough, so when she called and was about to die, the companion didn't hear her, which mirrors the tale of how Eleanor let her mother die. In a way, there's definitely like a history of death in or around the house. And of note, as I was writing this script, it actually just came to my mind, everyone who died on the grounds was a woman. An observation that I just made right now while writing this script. And I don't know what that is, but like the thought could be thunk that it is the spirits of the women who died on the grounds that are haunting the house. But this explanation lacks any teeth to it. Like, there are no physical manifestations of anything even remotely human-like, save for, I guess, the words in the writing that shows up that entreats Eleanor for mother and home and all of that business. Like, the only human-shaped creepy things in the house are the faces of the children in the nursery and the statue of Crane, which were both created by people and put into the house at the beginning. So maybe not that right, but at a point we do get the instance where Eleanor sees this invisible person making footprints in the grass and calling her name out after her, and it does make Eleanor feel like she's been waiting to hear that for her entire life. Though, the way that Eleanor focuses so much during her weird paranormal experiences on her mother makes me think that this specific instance is not a real thing and was in fact her having this regretful hallucination against her mother or something like that. We don't know, but like this call, it says Eleanor, Eleanor, and it makes Eleanor feel like she'd been waiting to hear this call for her entire life. We don't know what that really means. And we're also made aware of the fact that Eleanor, like I mentioned earlier, can see and perceive things in and around the house without actually being there to see or hear them. And then we get this kind of whirlwind possessed rush through the house that Eleanor does later in something of a fugue state, slamming on the doors and frightening everyone and causing the incident where Luke has to chase her up the old rotten rickety stairs in the library tower. This matches exactly with the experience that Eleanor and Theo had at the very beginning when something is stomping up and down the hallway and scratching at the door and trying to get in and all of that. And there is some very tinfoil hat crackpotty kind of theory I could make here about it being a kind of time loopy sort of time travel ghost sort of thing, where what Eleanor and Theo were experiencing during that first night was actually Eleanor outside in this ghostly possessed fugue state, stomping up and down and slamming on the doors and trying to get into their room and all of that, while she was also actually at the same time inside and experiencing it with Theo. This is tinfoil hat and is something that I would not put in an academic paper unless I was trying really hard to make the whole paper sound like that. So take that one with a grain of salt, right? This is not the only experience where Eleanor is not in control of her body or her speech. Luke even comments at some point when Eleanor is going off on some little sing-songy tangent by herself. Luke comments that she's done this before, and then she kind of regains sentience and control back of her mind and doesn't remember what she was saying just a second ago. So pretty solid for possession or control of some sort there, I think. I think that during the time when the main party is in the house, it is being haunted by Eleanor's ability to manifest poltergeist activity, by Theo's ability to receive and transmit thoughts, and by whatever ambient malice, sadness, loneliness, suffering, etc. that lingers in the house. Add to this the fact that the house is designed in such a way as to cause some kind of low-scale craziness in anyone who lives there. And it kind of becomes plain that the house intensifies mental instability to a level that would drive any normal person to leave quickly, but which drives Eleanor, the psychically sensitive and paranormally sensitive, to completely surrender to whatever malevolence might be within those walls. It even says at the very beginning of the book, and I'm going to try to do this in such a manner that I do not incur any copyright damage, but it says, let's see here. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and the stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. So something is there. And that's established on the very first page. Of course, at the end of the story, spoilers, the story adds another death to the house's collection in the form of when they try to send Eleanor away in her car. And Eleanor is like, yes, no, there's no way that you could totally send me away from this house. I am a part of this house. I will live here forever. And then she takes her car, crashes it directly into the big tree in the driveway, and dies. And then that's kind of where the story ends after that. There's a little bit of stuff that happens afterwards. Not really a super great wrap-up. It's more just like yeah, this house is still kind of screwy. Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, its walls continued upright. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Which is a delicious bookend to start with that sentence and then to end with that sentence as well. Oh, chef's kiss. I love Shirley Jackson for this kind of stuff, and she is just so good. Crucially, Jackson, who is a powerfully forward-thinking feminist author, does not kill and bury her lesbian. It is somewhat weird because, like, okay, this is off script now. We're going off script. Theo is a lesbian, like, absolutely. It's almost impossible to read her otherwise. And I think because of the sort of, like, sympathetic link that she establishes with Eleanor, she also shows a predilection, perhaps a natural tendency to fall into the same kind of lesbianistic tendencies, I guess, during the first bits of the book when, like, the two of them are very close. They instantly start, like, a very friendly relationship, and they, like, sleep in the same room, and they share their clothes, and, like, Theo paints Eleanor's nails, and, like, it seems like there is the possibility that Theo and Eleanor might enter into a relationship themselves. But then everybody goes crazy, and that kind of goes downhill. I think that's very, very cool. More power to the lesbians that don't die in the story. Of course, I'm talking about a book that was written ever, and that people have read. So there are 1,000 million billion more things that can be said about the story. Details that I've left out or missed, themes and politics and new historicist reading, and everything that would allow any reader to come to any of a million different conclusions that are not the one that I chose to talk about in this video. However, this script is already 6 single-spaced pages long and counting, and my PhD is focused on sci-fi lit and not horror, so I can only fit so much in one effort before it should really be either an academic paper in length or a series of videos that analyze different things about the story itself, which I think would be fun, but I don't know if I've got the kind of effort for that. But nevertheless, if you have not read Shirley Jackson's Hill House, I highly recommend it. It is very good. It is like a touchstone of modern horror fiction. A lot of people have put this on the list of, like, the scariest books that they've ever read, even though it wasn't really that scary for me, but it does scratch all of the itches that I was looking for a haunted house story. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, go buy a copy right now. Put this information into your brain. Don't expect it to be a one-to-one corollary to any of the adaptations that might be out right now. Unless you want to watch Rose Red. It's a pretty good kind of pulpy companion to The Haunting of Hill House. So, that is as much as I'm probably going to be able to say about The Haunting of Hill House right now. I might come back to it later if you guys are interested in, like, a more in-depth academic reading of it, or if you wanted me to do, like, a specific like, dive into like, certain themes or politic or something like that. I'm totally down to do it because this is a very good book. But we're going to be done with it for now, I think. It is my goal to release 26 literature videos, at least, in 2023. one every 2 weeks or so. I'm a little bit behind on this one, so my next one is going to have to be bumped up, but we'll see what that is. I have the next 3 or 4 books that I want to do, but if you have any suggestions about books that are in print right now that you would like for me to read and do an analysis of, like these ones, or like any of the other stuff that I've been doing, please tell me in the comments down below. Recommend to me a book, tell me the title, the author, and what you think I would like about the book, or what you think would be interesting to see about it, and I might put that on the list of stuff to do. I've got a Discord if you want to come in and talk about book stuff or video game stuff. Thank you very much for coming and watching. If you are interested in more sort of literary analysis like what I've got right now, there is a link on the screen somewhere. I don't know where I'll put it, but that will take you to one of the other books that I've talked about. There is also a playlist of all of the like weird fiction and horror fiction and stuff that I have talked about on this channel, which will also be on the screen. If you haven't done it already, please click the like and subscribe buttons and all of that. Like, turn the button the correct color. You live on YouTube, you know what you're doing. I will see you next time.